An active duty sheriff deputy is suddenly stripped of his badge and arrested for kidnapping in the exact same jurisdiction where an 84-year-old woman vanished without a trace just weeks prior. The internet algorithms immediately seized upon this coincidence. Millions of views were generated overnight by amateur sleuths declaring the case solved. They pointed to the badge. They pointed to the geography. It is a narrative that makes perfect intuitive sense to a public hungry for a dramatic resolution. It is also a narrative that is completely and forensically false. Welcome to the dangerous intersection of institutional misconduct and algorithmic hysteria. When a high-profile abduction occurs, the public desperately wants a singular villain to blame. So when a sworn officer from the very department investigating the disappearance is taken into custody for an unrelated abduction charge, the line between verifiable fact and viral speculation disintegrates. We are completely disregarding the internet noise to focus entirely on the locked timeline and the verified physical evidence. If you want to understand why proximity does not equal causality and why this specific deputy is statistically and behaviorally excluded from the primary abduction investigation, you must look at the court documents and the digital footprint left at the crime scene. Subscribe to True Crime with Liam for verified legal analysis rather than internet hysteria as we dismantle the rumors surrounding this investigation. The reality of what happened in that affluent desert neighborhood is far more calculated and terrifying than a rogue deputy acting on impulse. To understand the true nature of this phantom suspect, we have to examine the exact moment the illusion of perimeter security was shattered. The distinction between a crime of opportunity and a highly premeditated tactical strike is everything in criminal profiling. The algorithmic rumors blur this line, actively damaging the public understanding of the investigation. We are stepping away from the comment sections and stepping into the sterile environment of forensic analysis. The facts of the initial disappearance remain unchanged and unresolved. An elderly woman was taken, a digital footprint was erased, and a suspect completely unrelated to the disgraced officer is still walking free. Let us analyze the verified timeline. The true terror lies not in a sudden betrayal by law enforcement, but in the cold calculation of an unknown entity who watched and waited in the dark. The Catalina foothills represent a specific kind of American security. It is an environment defined by extreme affluence, where the architecture itself is designed to project safety and isolation. The properties are sprawling and the sightlines are meticulously controlled. Residents here do not typically concern themselves with opportunistic street crime. They invest heavily in physical barriers and digital surveillance networks to maintain an absolute perimeter of privacy. It is within this highly monitored oasis that the target, an 84-year-old woman, was dropped off at her residence by her son-in-law. The time was exactly 9:50 in the evening. This precise timestamp is not merely a passing detail in a police report. It is the critical anchor point of our entire forensic timeline. The 9:50 arrival establishes the definitive beginning of the operational window for the perpetrator. Up until that exact minute, the target was moving and accompanied. After that minute, she was stationary and isolated inside a fortress of perceived security. The anomaly here is staggering when viewed through an analytical lens. Home invasions in neighborhoods of this socioeconomic tier are rarely random. The physical geography of the foothills is notoriously difficult to navigate rapidly without prior reconnaissance. The winding roads and the layered security protocols act as natural deterrents to crimes of sudden opportunity. Yet the perpetrator did not simply stumble upon this specific residence. The evidence suggests a terrifying familiarity with the property layout. To breach a home in this specific enclave without triggering an immediate armed response requires more than just forced entry. It requires a granular understanding of the habits of the target and the specific blind spots of the defense systems of the property. The 9:50 drop-off was the catalyst. It was the moment the pieces were set on the board. The son-in-law drove away, leaving the elderly woman alone in the sprawling quiet of the desert night. The doors were locked. The alarm systems were presumably armed. To the outside observer, the perimeter was impenetrable. The house projected an aura of total domestic tranquility. But security is often an illusion, maintained only until someone decides to test its breaking point. A timeline analysis of the subsequent events proves that the residence was not truly isolated at all. The perimeter was already compromised. The target was already trapped. She was sitting in the quiet of her home entirely unaware that her physical and digital barriers were about to be systematically dismantled. By 10 o'clock that evening, the house was outwardly secure. But the cold reality of the forensic timeline shows that the perimeter was already actively being monitored from the dark. The perpetrator was not a random drifter looking for an unlocked door. They were an entity waiting for the exact variable of isolation to be met. The departure of the family member was the final necessary condition. The silence that fell over the property was not a sign of safety. It was the countdown to a highly tactical operation. The architecture designed to keep intruders out was about to be weaponized to keep the victim in. The chilling truth is that the fortress had already failed before the first physical breach even occurred. The unease settles into the timeline precisely because of this invisible observation. The illusion of safety is always most absolute right before it is violently shattered. The digital locks and cameras were waiting for a threat they could not comprehend. The forensic narrative shifts abruptly from passive observation to active tactical execution in the early hours of February 1st. The transition is marked not by physical violence or a forced entry alarm, but by a calculated digital silence. At exactly 1:47 in the morning, the surveillance network of the residence sustained its first targeted casualty. The primary doorbell camera was manually disconnected by an individual whose physical features were heavily obscured by a mask and gloves. This is the first verifiable physical contact the perpetrator made with the perimeter. The method of disconnection is critically important to our analysis. This was not a system failure or a connectivity glitch. It was a deliberate physical intervention meant to blind the primary digital witness at the entry point. The suspect understood exactly where the camera was positioned and how to neutralize it without triggering a secondary alert. This action alone elevates the threat profile from a standard burglary to a highly sophisticated intrusion. The suspect did not smash the lens or cut a visible wire in a panic. They executed a precise disconnection. From 1:47 onward, the front vector of the property was completely dark to the digital network. The perpetrator now had a secure blind spot to operate within. But the true horror of this operation is revealed 41 minutes later. At 2:28 in the morning, a deeply personal and internal digital tether was severed. The 84-year-old victim relied on a medical pacemaker, which communicated vital telemetry data to an application on her mobile device. At 2:28, that connection was totally and permanently lost. The pacemaker application registered a complete disconnect. This timestamp is the most chilling piece of evidence in the entire investigation. It means that the victim was separated from her mobile device, or the device itself was destroyed or disabled at that exact moment. We now possess a terrifyingly precise 41-minute operational window. Between 1:47 and 2:28, the perpetrator breached the physical structure, located the victim, and neutralized her ability to communicate with the outside world. The clinical efficiency of this timeline is staggering. 41 minutes to navigate an unfamiliar affluent residence, subdue an occupant, and execute an abduction without leaving a single trace of biological evidence behind. There was no chaotic struggle documented by secondary audio sensors. There were no accidental alarm trips. There was only a methodical progression of digital blind spots. First, the external perimeter was blinded. Then the internal communication tether was severed. The perpetrator moved through the environment like a phantom, systematically turning off the lights on the investigative dashboard. When law enforcement eventually arrived, they found a sterile crime scene. The absence of evidence became the primary evidence. The silence was deafening. To execute an abduction of this magnitude within a 41-minute window requires significant physical capability and intense psychological control. It requires an understanding of digital security networks and medical telemetry. It is a profile that demands extreme competence and preparation. The digital footprint left behind is entirely composed of deliberate silences and calculated disconnections. The question that haunts the investigative team is not simply how this was done, but who possesses the specific intersection of skills necessary to execute it flawlessly. Who has the capability to bypass external hardware and instantly neutralize internal mobile telemetry while leaving zero physical trace? The precision points away from an amateur and towards an individual with specialized training or extensive experience in tactical breaching. This 41-minute void in the timeline represents a total failure of modern security systems against a prepared adversary. The perpetrator did not just break into a house, they dismantled a highly secure ecosystem from the outside in. They turned a sanctuary into a digital dead zone, and they did it all without making a sound. The absolute perfection of this execution is exactly what makes the subsequent algorithmic hysteria so frustrating to analyze. The investigation into the Phantom of the Catalina foothills was operating in a state of high tension and low evidence when an institutional shockwave derailed the public narrative. On March 26, the community experienced a secondary trauma that completely fractured the collective focus. A sworn officer, a Pima County sheriff deputy named Travis Reynolds, was suddenly arrested by the Tucson Police Department. The charge was severe and immediately incendiary. Reynolds was officially terminated and booked on felony kidnapping charges. The algorithmic reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The public discourse was immediately consumed by an overwhelming wave of confirmation bias. The logic of the internet was simple and seemingly unassailable. An 84-year-old woman had been kidnapped in Pima County. A Pima County deputy was now arrested for kidnapping. Therefore, the deputy must be the architect of the Catalina foothills abduction. The geographical proximity and the identical legal terminology of the charges created a perfect storm of viral speculation. Amateur investigators flooded social media platforms, connecting invisible dots and declaring the entire local law enforcement apparatus compromised. They argued that only a deputy would possess the tactical knowledge required to bypass the foothills security systems. They theorized that the lack of biological evidence was the result of a professional forensic cleanup orchestrated by an insider. The arrest of Travis Reynolds provided a face and a badge to project all the terror and frustration of the unsolved case onto. The algorithmic ecosystem thrives on this exact type of institutional betrayal narrative. It generates massive engagement because it validates the deepest societal fears of corruption and vulnerability. For days, the digital conversation was entirely hijacked by this singular theory. The true victim was entirely overshadowed by the spectacle of the disgraced deputy. But the internet algorithms do not read granular legal documents. They do not cross-reference behavioral profiles or analyze conflicting timelines. They operate on broad sensational associations. A rigorous clinical examination of the arrest warrant and the interim complaint against Reynolds reveals a narrative that completely contradicts the viral consensus. The true details of his alleged crimes are documented in sterile legal language completely devoid of the tactical brilliance attributed to the Foothills Phantom. The proximity of the two events is undeniable, but proximity in criminal investigations is often the most dangerous form of bias. When you strip away the uniform and look exclusively at the behavioral mechanics of the crimes, a massive discrepancy emerges. We are no longer looking at a master tactician. We are looking at a fundamentally different psychological profile altogether. If you rely on cross-verified court documents over social media algorithms and demand to see the actual evidence rather than the viral rumors, hit subscribe to True Crime with Liam. The truth hidden in the case files is far less sensational than a grand police conspiracy, but it is far more crucial to understanding the reality of the threat. The arrest of the deputy was not the climax of the Foothills investigation. It was a massive, destructive distraction. The algorithmic certainty was built on a foundation of completely disparate facts. And the moment you compare the physical evidence of the two events, the entire internet theory collapses under its own weight. The public desperately wanted closure. They wanted the monster to be unmasked, and they wanted the simplicity of a single villain. The human brain naturally seeks patterns, even when those patterns are entirely illusory. The badge provided the perfect camouflage for their fears. But forensic science does not care about viral engagement or narrative satisfaction. It only cares about the immutable facts of the timeline and the physical limitations of the human subjects involved. The true horror is that while the entire world was staring at the disgraced deputy, the actual perpetrator was slipping further into the shadows, entirely ignored by the digital mob. The diversion of attention was absolute. The institutional shock blinded the public to the very real and very distinct differences in how these two separate entities operated. The devil is always in the behavioral details. To dismantle the destructive illusion of proximity bias, we must return to the only objective truth available in this case, which is the physical and digital evidence captured at the Catalina Foothills residence. The entire viral theory rests on the assumption that Deputy Reynolds fits the profile of the individual who approached the door at 1:47 in the morning. We must therefore construct a highly specific forensic profile of that individual and hold it up against the known attributes of the disgraced officer. The surveillance footage recovered from the disconnected doorbell camera provides a brief but incredibly dense window for behavioral and physical analysis. The individual captured in those frames is an adult male. His height is forensically estimated to be between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches. This physical parameter is rigid. It is calculated based on the fixed geometry of the doorway and the camera angle. It cannot be negotiated by internet speculation. Beyond his physical dimensions, the suspect is heavily equipped in a manner that screams premeditation. He is wearing a tactical backpack, suggesting he arrived with specialized tools meant for breaching or restraint. More critically, he is carrying a firearm secured in a very specific type of holster. The presence of this holster is a massive behavioral tell. It indicates a comfort with weapons and a desire for rapid deployment. It is not a weapon tucked haphazardly into a waistband. It is integrated into his gear. This visual evidence paints a very clear picture of the perpetrator. This is a highly organized offender. The presence of the tactical backpack, the specific firearm retention system, and the heavy obscuring of his physical features demonstrate a deep commitment to the operation. He arrived at the perimeter fully prepared to bypass security, neutralize the target, and extract her without leaving a trace. He was calm, methodical, and utterly silent. He did not improvise. He executed a rehearsed plan. This profile, the Phantom of the Foothills, is the baseline against which all potential suspects must be measured. Law enforcement investigators do not arrest people based on viral theories. They arrest people when their physical reality intersects with the physical reality of the crime scene. The internet looked at the badge of Travis Reynolds and stopped thinking. The forensic analysts looked at the suspect captured on the camera and began measuring. They measured height, they measured gait, they measured the specific way the equipment was carried, and most importantly, they measured the underlying psychology of the operation. The Foothills abduction was a crime of extreme preparation and zero opportunity. The suspect chose the hardest possible target, an affluent, secured perimeter, and penetrated it with surgical precision. This is a behavioral signature that cannot be faked or altered. It is the core identity of the perpetrator. The forensic profile points to an entity who thrives in the shadows, who plans for weeks or months, and who executes with absolute coldness. We must now take this sterile, rigid profile and forcefully collide it with the documented behavior and the physical reality of the former deputy. The public conversation demands that these two entities are the same person. The internet. Algorithms demand that the narrative of the corrupt cop resolving the mysterious abduction is true, but the physical evidence stands as an immovable barrier to that conclusion. The individual on the porch at 1:47 in the morning possesses a very specific set of dimensions and a very specific tactical mindset. If Travis Reynolds does not perfectly align with every single one of those data points, then the viral theory is dead. The investigation must remain rigidly attached to the 1:47 surveillance footage. That masked figure is the only reality that matters. Every minute spent analyzing the disgraced deputy is a minute stolen from the 84-year-old victim who was dragged into the dark. The forensic focus must remain absolute and clinical. We have to strip away the noise of the media circus and look exclusively at the math. Height, equipment, tactical proficiency, and psychological discipline. These are the metrics of the true perpetrator. The upcoming comparison will clearly define the vast chasm between a disciplined tactical strike and the messy reality of opportunistic corruption. The digital evidence has given us the exact shape of the monster. Now we just have to see who fits inside that specific silhouette. The contrast between the discipline phantom on the porch and the reality of the disgraced officer will serve as a masterclass in why forensic evidence must always supersede algorithmic convenience. The truth is written in the pixels of the doorbell camera, not in the trending topics of a social media platform. The reality of the disgraced officer is found not in a sophisticated suburban breach, but in the mundane environment of a patrol vehicle on March 19. According to the interim complaint filed against him, his actions constituted a gross abuse of state granted authority. He was tasked with the routine transport of a female detainee to the local jail facility. This was a standard operational procedure transformed into an opportunistic predation. The records indicate he unlawfully confined this unrelated woman, leveraging the immense power dynamic of his official position and the physical isolation of his government-issued cruiser. His actions were allegedly captured and partially corroborated by the institutional surveillance systems surrounding the holding facility. This was not a master criminal executing a flawless tactical operation in the dead of night. This was a deeply flawed individual who saw a momentary vulnerability in a person already within the custody of the legal system and chose to exploit it with reckless abandon. The sheer messiness of this specific offense is staggering when placed under a rigorous analytical lens. He operated within an environment heavily monitored by his own overarching department. He left an undeniable trail of digital documentation and institutional evidence that immediately flagged his behavior. The public conflation of this horrific but deeply incompetent act of corruption with a ghost-like extraction from a fortified estate created a catastrophic bottleneck for the primary investigators. Law enforcement professionals suddenly found themselves fighting a desperate two-front war. They were actively hunting a highly capable unknown subject while simultaneously battling a tidal wave of algorithmic misinformation fueled by their own compromised personnel. The institutional betrayal was entirely real, but its direct application to the ongoing missing persons investigation was a complete fabrication born of geographical proximity. Support forensic data-driven true crime analysis by subscribing to True Crime with Liam as we continue to dissect the grim realities of this complex situation. The tangible damage caused by the viral spread of this false connection simply cannot be overstated in a modern context. Precious investigative hours that should have been dedicated exclusively to tracing the complex digital sabotage of the targeted residents were instead consumed by the exhausting necessity of managing public outrage. The investigating agency had to repeatedly clarify the rigid separation of the two distinct events to a public that refused to listen. The social media algorithms actively rewarded outrage over accuracy, pushing the false narrative into millions of digital feeds and effectively burying the actual verifiable parameters of the true suspect. The overarching community impact was profound and immediately destructive. Public trust in the primary investigating agency plummeted at the exact moment their resources and community cooperation were most critically needed. The narrative of the rogue law enforcement officer was simply too compelling and cinematic for the internet ecosystem to willingly abandon. It provided a neat, easily digestible resolution to a case that was fundamentally terrifying, specifically because of its total lack of obvious answers. But the forensic reality remains stubbornly and entirely divorced from the loud public consensus. The specific individual who abused a vulnerable detainee in the back of a police cruiser fundamentally lacked the operational discipline, the advanced technical knowledge, and the cold psychological profile required to bypass a layered domestic security system without leaving a single trace behind. We are actively looking at two entirely different spectrums of criminal behavior occurring simultaneously within the identical geographical boundary. One event is a crime of chaotic opportunity fueled by staggering arrogance and a deeply false sense of institutional immunity. The other event is a crime of chilling premeditation executed with terrifying precision. To carelessly merge them is to profoundly misunderstand the fundamental nature of both offenses and to actively aid the true perpetrator by muddying the investigative waters. The noise of the scandal completely drowned out the silence of the actual crime scene. The investigators knew they had to definitively sever this artificial link before the case went entirely cold. The definitive Severing of this viral narrative required an authority that superseded local jurisdiction and internet speculation. The intervention came in the form of rigorous behavioral analysis conducted by former federal investigators. Ex-FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer reviewed the available data and publicly stated that the physical and behavioral profiles completely rule out the disgraced deputy. Her expert assessment highlighted the massive chasm between the two differing modes of operation. The science of criminal profiling hinges on the understanding that past behavior is the most reliable predictor of future actions. The deputy demonstrated a distinct pattern of leveraging his official capacity to trap individuals who were already severely compromised. His methodology relied entirely on the uniform, the badge, and the inherent compliance demanded by the state. Take away the cruiser and the authority, and his capacity to execute a complex crime diminishes rapidly. The entity responsible for the extraction in the desert operates on a fundamentally different psychological plane. This unknown subject did not rely on a badge to gain entry or ensure compliance. They relied on intensive preparation, stealth, and a total mastery of the physical environment. Furthermore, the expert analysis pointed to an undeniable physical mismatch that the internet sleuths actively ignored. The structural build of the deputy completely contradicted the spatial and dimensional data extracted from the initial crime scene. You cannot alter your foundational physical geometry to fit a narrative. The forensic exclusion was absolute and undeniable. The internet had spent weeks hunting the wrong ghost. The deputy was nothing more than an opportunistic predator who utilized the shield of his profession to commit a localized abuse of power. The true suspect is a highly prepared, methodical phantom who views digital security networks not as obstacles, but as tools to be systematically disabled. They are two completely separate entities operating within one county, completely unaware of each other, until the algorithmic hysteria forced them into the same conversation. The realization of this total separation is the most chilling peak of the entire narrative. The public had been comforted by the false belief that the monster was already in a jail cell. The federal analysis shattered that comfort entirely. It forced the community to confront the terrifying reality that the architect of the flawless extraction was still out there, moving freely and potentially observing the chaos they had indirectly caused. The absolute clarity provided by the behavioral experts shifted the paradigm of the investigation back to its rightful center. The noise of the institutional scandal was finally categorized as a secondary, unrelated trauma. The primary trauma remained unsolved, and the entity responsible remained unidentified. This level of forensic clarity is exactly why we must demand verifiable facts over engaging theories. The truth is often deeply unsatisfying to an audience seeking a rapid conclusion, but it is the only path forward in a legitimate investigation. The definitive separation of the profiles means the investigators must return to the sterile vacuum of the original crime scene. They must look past the distraction of the broken badge and refocus entirely on the digital silences and the missing telemetry. The perpetrator is not a rogue cop. The perpetrator is someone entirely different, entirely unknown, and vastly more capable. The sheer scale of the preparation required to execute the original offense points toward an individual who has likely done this before or who has trained extensively for this exact scenario. The behavioral profile suggests a level of patience that is deeply unnerving. They waited for the perfect alignment of variables before striking. The public must absorb this terrifying truth. The viral rumor is dead and buried under the weight of federal analysis and physical impossibility. The focus must snap back to the desert and the empty house. The aftermath of this forensic separation leaves a somber and heavily fractured reality. The disgraced deputy has been permanently neutralized and now faces the full weight of the judicial system for his specific alleged actions. He is locked away, stripped of his authority, and will answer for the terror he inflicted on his victim in the back of that cruiser. His narrative is effectively closed. But the primary narrative, the reason this investigation began, remains a gaping open wound in the community. The elderly matriarch is still missing. The official classification of foul play firmly stands without any alteration. Law enforcement continues to treat the situation as an active and highly dangerous abduction. The resolution of the viral rumor did not bring the victim home. It merely cleared the smoke from the battlefield, revealing an enemy that is still entirely hidden. The public must now grapple with the grim understanding that their collective focus was entirely misplaced. The energy spent analyzing the life and career of the deputy was energy diverted from the search for a tactical kidnapper. The true predator likely watched the massive online misdirection with a sense of deep satisfaction. The algorithm provided them with the ultimate cover story. As the community slowly accepts the reality of the forensic exclusion, a profound sense of vulnerability returns. The realization sets in that a highly organized individual who knows exactly how to bypass sophisticated residential security infrastructure is still actively walking the streets. The initial terror of the timeline rushes back to the forefront. The brief operational timeframe remains unexplained. The complete absence of biological material remains a staggering investigative hurdle. The digital ghost has not made a single mistake since the night of the incident. The case has returned to its terrifying origins. There is no corrupt insider to blame. There is only the cold, hard reality of a flawless execution and an ongoing silence. The investigating team is back to analyzing digital breadcrumbs and hoping for a single microscopic error from an adversary who has proven to be incredibly disciplined. The resolution of the secondary scandal brings no peace. It only sharpens the focus on the vast, terrifying unknown. The true monster was never wearing a uniform. Differentiating between opportunistic crimes of authority and highly organized, premeditated home invasions is the critical lesson of this entire ordeal. An opportunistic offender reacts to immediate circumstances, exploiting sudden vulnerabilities. A targeted attacker engineers the circumstances, manipulating the environment to create the exact vulnerability they require. Recognizing the specific digital markers of a targeted attack is paramount for modern safety. The sequential disabling of external perimeter monitoring devices, followed directly by the severing of internal medical telemetry, is not a coincidence. It is the definitive signature of a sophisticated threat actor neutralizing a target from the outside in. What this incredibly complex case teaches us about the severe danger of proximity bias in the digital age is profoundly disturbing, analytically framing how viral, social, media algorithms actively conflate geographically proximate but forensically unrelated crimes reveals a massive vulnerability in our societal processing of information. Algorithms prioritize engagement over truth, actively jeopardizing law enforcement resources and community safety by fueling massive misdirection campaigns. We must train ourselves to recognize the absolute difference between geographic coincidence and verified behavioral evidence. The timeline is permanently locked. The forensic profiles are definitively separated. The noise has finally been cleared from the board, leaving only the chilling facts of the original event. But one massive analytical void remains utterly unexplained. If the perpetrator knew exactly how to bypass both the physical barriers and the complex digital security infrastructure of that specific isolated residence who supplied the advanced intelligence required to execute the strike. Leave your forensic theories in the comments below and subscribe to True Crime with Liam as we continue to track the verified facts of this ongoing case.